In March 2026, a manuscript arrived at the London office of a literary agent named Caroline Michel. The author was 92 years old. His name was Peter Russell. He had served in the household of Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, from 1954 to 1968. 14 years, the longest single posting of any staff member in her private apartments. He had kept a journal the entire time. He had not opened it since 1968. He had waited until every member of the royal family who might have contested its contents was dead, and then he waited another 3 years for good measure. Princess Margaret died on February 9, 2002, aged 71, following a stroke. The Queen Mother died 7 weeks later. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022. By 2025, Russell reportedly retrieved the journal, prepared the manuscript, and contacted Michel's office. He delivered it in March 2026. It was 284 pages long. It contained, among other things, the names of 4 men Princess Margaret had affairs with, whose identities have never been public, the exact date she first struck a household member, and the phrase, which he recorded verbatim in his journal on August 11, 1962, that she used on that morning to describe her own mother. Royal biography has, for 70 years, been written almost entirely from the perspective of the court, authorized biographers with carefully managed access, family members who chose what to disclose, sanctioned journalists working within understood limits. Russell's manuscript is the first significant rupture from that pattern. A servant who outlived everyone, kept a contemporaneous record throughout, and retained no incentive to protect anyone. Peter Russell came to Margaret's household in 1954. The precise route, whether through placement agency, personal recommendation, or the formal circuit of royal household appointments, isn't documented in any available source. What is documented is his function once he arrived. He stood at Margaret's left or right shoulder at formal engagements, holding an ashtray. This wasn't a peripheral duty. Margaret smoked up to 60 cigarettes a day, Chesterfields in the early years, Benson and Hedges later, and the requirement for a receptacle was constant and continuous throughout any social occasion. His job was to ensure she never had to look for one. He described it afterward as standing there all night, positioned at her shoulder so she didn't have to look to see where she flicked. He was part of the equipment the evening required. The remark he eventually made publicly about this role is the one that lodged in subsequent biographies. Princess Margaret treated people like human ashtrays. He said this in 1987 in a documentary called Royal Servants Behind Closed Doors. He appeared on camera, delivered the line, and by all accounts said nothing further of substance about the household for the next 39 years. That 1987 appearance matters because it complicates any simple narrative of total silence. Russell spoke. What he didn't do was publish the journal or describe what was in it. His 1987 observation was a single, calibrated surface characterization, precise, memorable, bounded. Margaret was alive in 1987. The Queen Mother was alive. Snowdon was alive. The institution was fully operational. Everything Russell had actually recorded was still sealed. His 1987 disclosure was measured exactly against those conditions. The manuscript delivered in 2026 is a different order of disclosure entirely. Whether his 14-year tenure was definitively the longest of any staff member, specifically in Margaret's private apartments, as opposed to the broader Kensington Palace household, isn't independently verifiable from available records. What is clear is that 14 years in a position requiring daily physical intimacy represents a very long time to watch someone closely and choose silence. To understand the authority of Russell's vantage point, You need to understand what a personal attendant in a 1950s royal household actually did, not as an abstraction, but as a sequence of daily events repeated every morning for 14 years. Princess Margaret's principal residence was apartment 1A at Kensington Palace, where she lived for nearly 42 years until her death. The palace's organization divided into two distinct worlds: the formal apartments, visible to the public, and the institutional records, and the back-of-house areas, the offices, the staff corridors, the service spaces, that allowed the household to function without ever appearing to function. The personal attendant moved between both worlds. That movement was the job. In a 1950s royal household, access was hierarchically determined by function. A footman worked in the dining room, visible at meals and formal occasions, invisible otherwise. A housemaid cleaned the public corridors and reception rooms. The lady-in-waiting accompanied the princess on official engagements, sat with her at dinner, traveled with her to Balmoral and Moustique, and the scheduled round of charitable functions. She saw the performance, dressed, prepared, socially present, playing the version of herself that public life required. The personal attendant entered the rooms no one else entered: the bedroom, the dressing room, the bathroom. These weren't exceptional events. They were the structural rhythm of every single day. The morning tray was the most intimate moment of the working day. Delivered to the private apartments before the principal was fully awake, it carried the correspondence, the pot of tea, the newspaper. The attendant who brought it was in the bedroom when the day had barely begun, before any presentation had been selected or any performance switched on. Craig Brown documented Margaret's morning routine from multiple sources in Ma'am Darling, situating it at around 1955, her mid-20s, when the pattern was establishing itself as the fixed architecture of her daily existence. She woke at approximately 9 o'clock. The newspapers arrived. Chesterfields were lit almost immediately. The Daily Mail summary of Brown's research circulated widely after it resurfaced on social media in 2024, noted the chain smoking beginning with the first waking hour. The papers eventually scattered across the floor of the bed. The radio was on. 2 hours passed in this state. Neither sleep nor performance, but something else entirely. A morning privacy that admitted no audience except the person required to be there. At 11 came the bath, drawn by a maid, an hour long. Then dressing, hair and makeup at the dresser. Each of these events happened inside the rooms that the rest of the household never entered. The clothes, which Margaret never wore more than once before having them cleaned, were laid out in advance. The selection had been made. The presentation was being assembled piece by piece. The person who assisted with that assembly was present before the public face existed, which is another way of saying they were present for the private one. This is what separated Russell's position from Anne Glenconner's, and from Craig Brown's careful reconstruction, and from every other account of Princess Margaret that appeared before 2026. Glenconner served as extra lady-in-waiting from 1971 to 2002. 30 years of genuine closeness. She called Margaret the best friend I ever had, and was the person Queen Elizabeth quietly thanked, after Margaret's death, for introducing her sister to Roddy Llewellyn. But Glenconner observed what Margaret chose to show: the dinner conversation, the Moustique mornings with the social circle assembled, the late evenings when guests lingered and the conversation sharpened. Brown, working from the widest available range of secondary material, diaries, footmen's memoirs, chauffeur recollections, the published notes of Cecil Beaton and Roy Strong and Alan Clark, assembled the finest account possible from the outside. What neither could access is what Russell sealed: entries made in the room itself, on mornings before the first cigarette was stubbed out, before the bath was drawn, before anyone else had arrived. The book, Yes, Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants, describes the hierarchy of intimacy in royal households as placing valets and personal attendants in a categorically different position from other staff, closer, structurally, than any role except, perhaps, the physician. The observation in the backstairs Billy literature about William Talon, the Queen Mother's devoted page for decades, makes the same point more directly. Only personal attendants and valets were permitted to bring certain items into the principal's private quarters. That restriction was the architecture of genuine access. It was also the architecture of genuine witness. What a valet heard in the course of an ordinary morning would have included conversations never intended for the record. Margaret on the telephone before the household was formally assembled for the day. Margaret in conversation with whoever had spent the night. Margaret in the unguarded hour before the social machinery was operational. Not performing graciousness, not performing wit, not performing the elaborate protocol consciousness that guests described when they reported how she could lull people into false security and then demolish them with regal, rank-pulling put-downs that were masterpieces of the art. The person standing in the dressing room at 9:15 in the morning was present for the Margaret who preceded all of that. Russell stood at that door every day for 14 years. He wrote down what he saw. The first dated incident in Russell's manuscript of Margaret throwing an object at a member of her household staff is set in 1957. She was 26. The Townsend affair had ended approximately 2 years earlier, and by multiple biographical accounts, this was a period of pronounced emotional instability. The Townsend story is the essential context for everything that followed in that household. Peter Townsend had been equerry to King George VI, appointed in 1944. Margaret told friends she fell in love with him during a 1947 tour of southern Africa, where they went riding together through the days of a 3-month visit that was Margaret's first trip abroad. By 1952, when his divorce was finalized and her father died of lung cancer on the 6th of February, the relationship had become serious enough to require institutional management. At the June 1953 coronation, a tabloid reporter spotted Margaret brushing a piece of lint from Townsend's lapel. The gesture was barely more than domestic, but in the charged atmosphere of a new reign, it was enough. Sir Alan Lascelles, the Queen's principal private secretary, told Townsend that any thought of marrying the princess was out of the question. Townsend was posted to Brussels as air attaché. For 2 years, they wrote to each other almost daily. On October 31, 1955, BBC newsreader John Snagg interrupted normal programming. He read a brief statement from the princess. In it, she said she was mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth. She had resolved to put those considerations before any others. She wouldn't marry Townsend. She was 25, the age at which she was legally free to marry without the sovereign's consent. Townsend gave an interview to the BBC in 1978 while promoting his autobiography. He described the preceding weeks, the days besieged by reporters outside the flat, the world's press discussing their situation in every capital, and said that whatever he had meant to her, he had not been enough to compensate for the serious losses she would have suffered. She would have been stripped of practically everything. Government papers released in 2004, 2 years after Margaret's death, suggested the conditions she faced weren't quite as all or nothing as the public understood. A compromise had apparently been reached. She might have retained her royal title and civil list income, given up her rights to the succession, and married in a register office. The papers also contained a letter Margaret had written to Prime Minister Anthony Eden in August 1955, saying she would see Townsend in October and that it's only by seeing him in this way that I feel I can properly decide whether I can marry him or not. That letter, released when every principal was safely dead, suggested her determination was somewhat less absolute than the mythology had required it to be. Townsend moved back to Belgium, married Marie-Luce Germania, a 20-year-old tobacco heiress, and died in 1995. Margaret married Armstrong Jones in May 1960 and told someone later, apparently without excessive reflection, "I didn't really want to marry at all. Why did I? Because he asked me. Really, though, he was such a nice person in those days." By 1957, 2 years after the decision and 4 years before Armstrong Jones, Margaret was 26 and publicly unattached, in an era when that status was increasingly difficult to maintain gracefully. The social circuit continued. The 400 Club, the Café de Paris in Coventry Street, the Mirabelle in Mayfair. The Margaret set that had gathered around her in the late 1940s and early 1950s had thinned as its members married, and press coverage had shifted from speculating whom she might marry to speculating whether she might remain a spinster. She was celebrated as the most glamorous young woman in England. She was also, by multiple accounts, increasingly erratic in private. The broader pattern of her treatment of staff and guests during this period is documented in the secondary literature. Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling records her throwing a trivial pursuit board in the air during a game, sending pieces across the room. Though that incident couldn't have occurred before 1981, when the game was published, and represents a fully developed expression of a temperament whose earlier forms appear in the 1950s. Contemporary accounts cited in Brown's research describe blunt outbursts to tearful servants. The Daily Mail's coverage of Brown's material identified a sadistic streak in her treatment of household staff. At a dinner party, she sat next to the model Twiggy and didn't speak to her for 2 hours. When she finally turned and asked who she was, and Twiggy replied, "I'm Leslie Hornby, ma'am, but people call me Twiggy," Margaret's response was, "How unfortunate." She was capable of extraordinary kindness to close friends and extraordinary cruelty to everyone else, sometimes within the same evening. The 1957 date in Russell's journal establishes this pattern's documented beginning, not its later expression. He was in the room. He wrote it down the same day. That precision, a specific incident on a recorded date, is what distinguishes the journal from retrospective characterization. A significant proportion of Russell's specific claims about incidents in the private apartments are, by structural necessity, unverifiable against independent sources. He was the only staff member present. Royal Household Service was organized to prevent multiple witnesses in the most private spaces. What Russell records from those rooms exists in the journal entry made at the time, not memory reconstructed across 6 decades, but a contemporaneous note. That is the document's strength and its limitation simultaneously. The former is considerable. The daily mechanics of Princess Margaret's drinking are among the best documented elements of her private life in the existing historical record. Specific enough and granular enough to serve as a reliable baseline against which Russell's manuscript adds the interior view that no outsider could have supplied. The routine from around 1955 is documented through Craig Brown's research in Ma'am Darling, drawn from multiple sources. It went like this. The morning began in bed at approximately 9 o'clock, not in the sense of gradually waking, in the sense of the day beginning there, with the tray, the papers, the radio already on. The Chesterfields were lit early. The newspapers accumulated around her, eventually scattered across the bed covers as Brown's sources recorded. For 2 hours this continued, smoking, reading, the radio in the background, the correspondence of the day visible but not yet acted upon. The tray was brought. The attendant who brought it remained available. The room smelled of the previous night and the morning's first cigarettes together. At 11, the bath. drawn by a maid, an hour long. Then the dressing room, hair and makeup. The business of the morning's physical preparation consuming roughly another hour. By 12:30, she descended. A vodka was waiting. The sources are consistent on this detail, consistent on the specific timing, and consistent on the fact that it was vodka, not whiskey, that began the day's drinking. The whiskey came later. The vodka before lunch was the entry point. Lunch was 4 courses. Approximately half a bottle of wine per person, shared usually with the Queen Mother during the Clarence House years. The 2 women who had lived together in Margaret's youth maintaining a lunchtime habit that the biographies describe as a regular feature of that household's rhythm. After the main courses, continental cheese in variety, and fruit, chain smoking between courses. By 2 o'clock, Margaret had consumed a morning's cigarettes, a pre-lunch vodka, and wine with the meal, and the afternoon had barely begun. The evening moved to whiskey. Not any whiskey. Famous grouse, with Malvern water as the only acceptable mixer. Noel Botham's 2002 biography noted a decanter of famous grouse ever present on the drinks tray at her Clarence House apartments, available before she left for evening engagements. Hosts across London received advance notice. The famous grouse was to be available regardless of time, place, or occasion. Margaret was documented as noticing immediately when a different brand had been substituted in the decanter and refusing to drink it. At her own dinner parties, by Vogue's account, staff reportedly stood with famous grouse bottles positioned every 50 feet. Whether that is precise or impressionistic, it describes a household organized around the certainty of her consumption. Guests could leave only when she was ready to release them, which wasn't always before 4 in the morning. What Russell's manuscript adds to this documented outline is the interior operational picture, the staff choreography that made the daily presentation viable, the scheduling adjustments built around a consumption pattern that began at 12:30 and continued until dawn, the gap between the official calendar's account of a princess performing her public duties and the practical reality of managing a principal whose capacity was determined by what she had already consumed before the engagement began. Craig Brown could document what was observable from the outside, the routine, the brands, the social consequences. What he couldn't document is what Russell recorded, the management layer, the institutional adjustments, the ways in which the household silently adapted to a condition it couldn't acknowledge. The escalation across 14 years is the other dimension. The 1955 routine was a beginning. By the mid-1960s, Margaret was in her mid-30s, the Snowdon marriage was in private deterioration, and the consumption that had been a fixture of her social life since her 20s had accumulated nearly a decade of compounding. Anne Glenconner, who began her service in 1971 and therefore observed none of the 1954 to 1968 period, documented Margaret's health attempts in the 1990s, the year-long alcohol and cigarette cessation as part of a prescribed cure, the neurological pause mid-sentence she observed in 1999, the brief silence before completing a thought that Glenconner attributed to early vascular damage. Glenconner watched the endpoint of a trajectory. Russell watched the years when that trajectory was being established, morning by morning, bottle by bottle, in a household where the condition was managed rather than addressed. Margaret suffered her first stroke in 1998 on Moustique. Further strokes followed in 2001 and early 2002. She died at King Edward VII's Hospital on the 9th of February, 2002, aged 71. She smoked up to 60 cigarettes daily throughout her adult life, and by multiple accounts, never seriously attempted to stop until the doctors made it a condition of continued survival. Her father, George VI, died of lung cancer in February 1952, his lungs destroyed by precisely this addiction, in a man who, in photographs of his final months, looks decades older than his 56 years. His younger daughter watched that death from close enough to touch, increased her own smoking in the years immediately following it, and maintained the pace for another 50 years. Russell watched the beginning of that second arc from approximately 3 feet away, every morning, for 14 years. The relationships Princess Margaret had that were part of the public record before Russell's manuscript require clear delineation, because what the manuscript claims to add is 4 more, documented in the full text, unnamed in the available Sunday Times excerpt, belonging entirely to the private history the journal contains. Peter Townsend is fully and exhaustively documented. The relationship became visible at the June 1953 coronation, ended with Margaret's October 1955 statement, and was relitigated in government papers released 2 years after her death. Townsend died in 1995. The documentary record is substantial. Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones on the 6th of May, 1960, at Westminster Abbey. He was created Earl of Snowdon the following year. The marriage was broadcast to a global television audience and described with characteristic acidity by Kingsley Amis as a union between a royal princess devoted to all that was most vapid and mindless in the world of entertainment and a photographer of bohemian tastes, a match made, he suggested, for an age that deserved it. And De Courcy's biography of Snowdon documents that by the early 1970s, both parties were conducting extramarital affairs. The divorce was finalized in 1978. Roddy Llewellyn, landscape gardener, 17 years Margaret's junior, entered her life around 1973 or 1974 through Colin Tennant, who had owned Mustique since 1958 and given Margaret a 10-acre plot there as a 1960 wedding present. In February 1976, the News of the World published photographs of the two of them in bathing suits on the island. Snowdon told Margaret's private secretary, Lord Napier, by telephone that he was leaving. Napier relayed the information to Margaret using coded language on an unsecured line. Her reported response was, "Oh, I see. Thank you, Nigel. I think that's the best news you've ever given me." The affair with Llewellyn lasted approximately 8 years. He attended her memorial service in 2002. Queen Elizabeth, in a 2018 documentary, reportedly thanked Anne Glenconner for introducing Margaret to Llewellyn. "I'd just like to say, Anne, it was rather difficult at moments, but I thank you so much for introducing Princess Margaret to Roddy, 'cause he made her really happy." Robin Douglas Home, jazz musician, nephew of former Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home, appears in Noel Botham's 2002 biography as having had an affair with Margaret, with letters reprinted in the text. When Margaret ended the relationship, Douglas Home died by suicide in 1968. Tim Heald's biography, written with access to the Royal Archives at Windsor, mentioned the Douglas Home affair in a single sentence and moved on. His reviewer at the Times identified this as one of the most conspicuous failures of biographical follow-through she had encountered. Rarely can a biographer have hinted at so much and said so pathetically little. That is the public record. 4 relationships, varying considerably in documentary quality. What Russell claims to add belongs entirely to the period 1954 to 1968. The late 1950s in particular, after Townsend and before Armstrong Jones, when Margaret was publicly unattached and moving through a social circle of artists, musicians, titled men, and celebrities, is the period biographers have most consistently identified as underexplored. The social world she inhabited during those years was well documented in its externals: the 400 Club, the Café de Paris, the evening gatherings of the Margaret set. What happened inside it was governed by the same code that governed everything else. What the staff witnessed remained unspoken. Craig Brown assembled the atmosphere of that period from every available angle. Pablo Picasso, in the early 1950s, told a friend that if they knew what he had done in dreams with the 2 royal ladies, They would take me to the Tower of London and chop off my head. Jeremy Thorpe, the review in the Times describes him as probably the weirdest liberal leader in history, was reportedly furious when Margaret announced her engagement to Armstrong Jones in 1960, having believed he was in contention. Peter Sellers attempted to seduce her in 1964, while Armstrong Jones was photographing Sellers's girlfriend, Britt Eklund, for a session Snowdon had arranged himself, and explained his motivation to his friend Lawrence Harvey with a measurement that no biographer has found occasion to verify independently. John Betjeman, Philip Larkin, and John Fowles were among the literary figures documented as besotted. The social orbit was wide and porous. The documentary record was incomplete by design, partly because the principals involved had reasons to protect the record, and partly because a household attendant standing at Margaret's shoulder in the Café de Paris at 1 a.m. wasn't someone who would be interviewed for the biography. He was the furniture. He was watching and writing it down later, and the notes were in the journal that wasn't opened again for 58 years. Whether Russell's 4 unnamed individuals represent genuine first disclosures, relationships that left no trace anywhere else, or names already whispered in royal circles but never printed, can't be established from the excerpt alone. What is certain is that he claims them as documented, recorded when the events occurred. The names are in the journal. The journal was made at the time. Kensington Palace in August 1962 was operating on the annual calendar that governed the royal family's summer movements. Multiple sources confirm the family traveled to Balmoral in early August. Photographs document the Duke of Edinburgh and Prince Charles at the estate around 23 August that year. Margaret, 31, 2 years into her marriage to Snowdon, with a son who had been born the previous November, was subject to the same cycle of family obligations that Balmoral represented. On August 11, 1962, Peter Russell was in the private apartments. He recorded in his journal something Margaret said about her mother. The Queen Mother in August 1962 was 62, still fully active, still occupying the position she had held since 1952 as the family's emotional center of gravity. Not the reigning monarch, but something more privately powerful, the standard against which the institution measured its own performance of family life. She would outlive both her daughters, surviving Margaret by 7 weeks and dying herself in March 2002, aged 101, at the Royal Lodge at Windsor. She had been at Margaret's bedside earlier that year, Margaret's funeral effectively her final public appearance. The Margaret and Queen Mother relationship is documented across multiple biographies as privately complicated in ways that public appearances never acknowledged. The wicked wit of Princess Margaret states plainly that their relationship wasn't always an easy one, especially after the death of her beloved father. George VI died in February 1952. The complication his death opened wasn't only grief, but the institutional decisions that followed, and the question of who had genuinely stood in Margaret's corner during the Townsend crisis. The Queen Mother's role in that crisis was never made fully public by any participant. She was sympathetic, a loving mother watching her younger daughter navigate an impossible situation, visibly distressed by the impossible options being presented. But sympathy didn't become intervention. When Townsend was posted to Brussels in 1953, she didn't move to prevent it. When the pressure built toward a public statement, she wasn't recorded as offering her daughter a way through. Craig Brown's research records that when the Queen Mother fretted privately about where a future Mrs. Townsend might live, Prince Philip replied, Brown notes the tone as heavy sarcasm, that it was still possible, even nowadays, to buy a house. Philip's sarcasm was presumably directed at the Queen Mother's distress, which was real enough to invite it, and which left Margaret exactly where she had been before. Marie Claire documented that Margaret was known to make ill-mannered comments toward the Queen Mother directly. The pattern was established and documented. It wasn't occasional. August 1962 was 10 years into a dynamic that had been shaped by the Townsend aftermath. A daughter who had made an irreversible sacrifice under institutional pressure, and a mother who had been the warmth of the institution rather than its opponent, which amounts to the same thing when the institution presses hard enough. Margaret was in the private apartments. She said something about her mother. Russell was in the room. What she said is in the journal, in his handwriting, dated that morning. The published Sunday Times excerpt identifies the entry and confirms that it contains a specific phrase, something Margaret said about the Queen Mother that morning that Russell judged significant enough to preserve verbatim. The exact wording appears in the full manuscript. It isn't reproduced in the available excerpt, and this account won't speculate beyond what the excerpt documents. What the excerpt establishes is that the phrase exists, is dated, is contemporary, and was recorded by someone who was present when it was said. Margaret believed she was heard only by the household furniture. She wasn't. Peter Russell submitted his resignation in 1968. The historical record provides only the dates. In service, 1954. Out of service, 1968. His account of the departure is in the manuscript, which remains the primary source for his own framing of it. What the surrounding context establishes is that the household he left in 1968 wasn't the household he had entered in 1954. By 1967 and 1968, the Snowdon marriage was in active, private collapse. Anne de Courcy's biography documents that both parties were conducting extramarital affairs by the early 1970s, a process whose roots were in the years immediately preceding Russell's departure. Snowdon was working full-time as a photographer for the Sunday Times. The irony of the Queen's brother-in-law filing for a newspaper while his wife managed the official duties of their position, not lost on those who observed it, and was, by the account of people who knew the household, openly unfaithful. Margaret was drinking through the daily rhythm documented above, managing a social calendar that sustained the public performance of a functioning royal marriage, while the private reality was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal from the people whose job it was to be in the rooms. The pattern of royal service throughout its history is that staff leave difficult households when the conditions become untenable. The downstairs Billy literature, the yes ma'am material, the country house studies that document domestic service across generations. They all document the same mechanism. You endure until you don't. And the decision to stop enduring is usually precipitated by a specific accumulation rather than a single event. 14 years is a very long endurance. Whatever Russell's specific stated reason, and it's in the manuscript, the departure in 1968 was also, inescapably, a decision about the journal. He kept it. He didn't destroy it. He sealed it and carried it out of Kensington Palace, and he stored it for nearly 60 years without opening it. That isn't the action of someone who wanted the record to disappear. It's the action of someone who understood, at some level, that what he had documented might eventually be required, and that the moment for it to be required had not yet arrived. Less than a month after Margaret's death in February 2002, the royal family moved quickly to close the household. 10 members of her staff were made redundant and ordered out of their grace and favor apartments at Kensington Palace. The Independent reported on the speed and efficiency of the action. The institution that had employed them for years concluded its obligations in weeks. The staff dispersed. Whatever they had seen and heard in those apartments, they carried with them into the rest of their lives, undocumented. Russell carried something different, a journal written at the time. Between 1968 and 2026, Russell surfaced occasionally. The 1987 documentary, The Human Ashtrays remark circulating in secondary literature. His name appearing in footnotes of biographies that sourced his public statements. None of this was the journal. The people who might have challenged its contents died in sequence across 35 years. Margaret, February 2002, aged 71, following a stroke at King Edward VII's Hospital in London. The Queen Mother, March 2002, aged 101, having attended Margaret's funeral as her final public appearance. Snowdon, 2017, Elizabeth II, September 2022, at Balmoral, after appointing Liz Truss as Prime Minister 2 days before her death. By 2025, when Russell reportedly began working with the manuscript, no one remained with standing or inclination to contest what he had written. The cynical reading of this timing deserves to be stated plainly, because the brief for this script explicitly requests it. By waiting until every potential litigant was dead, Russell also waited until the commercial conditions for publication were optimal. Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling had been a bestseller and had won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. Glenn Connor's Lady in Waiting had been an international success, reviewed in the New York Times and The Guardian and The New Yorker, generating a television series, a sequel, and a public profile for Glenn Connor that extended well into her 90s. Elizabeth II's death in September 2022 had triggered an enormous wave of royal publishing and public appetite for accounts of a world that was visibly closing. The market for a contemporaneous insider account of Princess Margaret's private household was, in 2026, as large as it had ever been or was likely to become. The cynical and principled readings aren't mutually exclusive. A man can genuinely decline to publish out of respect for the living, or caution regarding the consequences, or simple faithfulness to an unspoken code he had internalized over 14 years of service. And also choose his moment with careful attention to the conditions of publication. Russell's closing sentence in the manuscript suggests he understood the distinction between these motivations and chose a specific framing for what he had done. Not loyalty to the institution, not revenge against it, a debt to the record. What distinguishes his account from memoir is the journal itself. Russell didn't begin writing in 2025 with 60-year-old recollections filtered through subsequent events and the inevitable reshaping that memory performs on experience over time. He kept contemporaneous entries. The dates were fixed when they were written. The observations were current. The names were recorded when the events occurred. A household staff rota for 1962 at Kensington Palace, held, if it survives, in the Royal Archives at Windsor, where access is restricted and where the royal family maintains tight editorial control over what is publicly available, would confirm Russell's physical presence in the building on the dates he claims. What no rota can confirm is what he saw while he was there. The journal does that work, or claims to. The argument that Russell's manuscript represents a structural break in royal biography is most precisely stated when set against the specific categories of access that came before it. Marion Crawford, governess to Elizabeth and Margaret from approximately 1932, published The Little Princesses in 1950. Her access was to the children, the schoolroom, the family holidays, the domestic rhythms of a protected childhood. She described Margaret's light-hearted fun and frolics, and her amusing and outrageous antics. The royal family's response was disproportionate and entirely deliberate. Crawford was excluded from Margaret's wedding in 1960, 13 years after leaving service. She was cut off from the court she had served, the social world her position had given her access to, the people she had known. She died in Aberdeen in 1988, largely isolated. The deterrent her case provided wasn't proportionate to the severity of what she disclosed. It was designed as a signal to everyone else, and it held for decades. Craig Brown published Ma'am Darling in September 2017, 99 vignettes assembled from the widest possible range of secondary material. His chauffeur source, David Griffin, had driven Margaret for 26 years. A footman named David Payne had written a memoir that the Queen Mother succeeded in having banned in Britain. The published diaries of Alan Clark, Cecil Beaton, and Roy Strong supplied what private diarists will say when they're writing only for themselves. Clark's private note described Margaret as fat, ugly, dwarf-like, lecherous, and revoltingly tastelessly behaved. Beaton in 1973 wrote of a woman he had once admired, "Poor brute, I do feel sorry for her. Her eyes seem to have lost their vigor. Her complexion is now a dirty negligee pink satin, the sort of thing one sees in a disbanded dyer's shop window." Brown quoted both without softening. Anne Glenconner called the result, "that horrible book. We won't mention the name of the somebody who wrote it. I don't know why people want to rot her like that." The James Tate Black judges saw it differently. It won in 2018. Glenconner's Lady-in-Waiting, published the following year, covers 30 years as extra Lady-in-Waiting from 1971 until Margaret's death in 2002. Where Brown assembled from the outside, Glenconner spoke from genuine intimacy. Mystique, the private friendship, the late evenings when the social performance had relaxed into something more honest. Where Brown was the brilliant satirist constructing a portrait from fragments, Glenconner was the close friend offering the view from the adjacent chair, across 30 years of a friendship she described as the most important of her life. Neither could provide what Russell claims to provide, the category of access they occupied: governess to the children, biographer working from secondary sources, lady-in-waiting watching from the social circle, is categorically different from the personal attendant in the bedroom at 9 in the morning. Crawford watched the childhood self. Glenconner watched the social self across 3 decades. Brown assembled from the documented self, what appeared in other people's published diaries and memoirs and press accounts. The personal attendant was present for the private self, in the most private hours, in the period 1954 to 1968. As the gap between that private self and the public performance grew progressively wider, and the household staff grew progressively more aware of what they were managing and not permitted to say. This is why the manuscript lands where it does: a servant who outlived the system designed to silence him, a record made in real time, in the rooms where no performance was required. 58 years of waiting, ending in 284 pages, delivered to a literary agent's London office in March 2026, when there was no one left who had a reason to care what was in them, except the record. Peter Russell is 92 years old. He lives alone in a ground-floor flat in Pimlico, 3 streets from Buckingham Palace. He hasn't spoken to the press since the manuscript was published. He takes no calls. And in the final page of the book, he writes a single sentence about why he waited. "I served her," he writes. "She died. The people she hurt died. The people who hurt her died. And then I was the only one left who remembered what had actually happened. I owed it to the record. I didn't owe it to her." If this is the kind of history you come back to, subscribe. There are more of them.